Winter, 1944, Nebraska. The sky hung low and pale over the frozen plains. Inside the barbed wire fences of Camp Atlanta, Captain Erich Vollmer of the Wehrmacht rubbed frost from his window. Beyond the fence, he saw something he could not explain. Lines of American civilians, wrapped in wool coats and worn gloves, moved slowly toward a small wooden church. Each carried a sack, some with wheat, some with eggs, others with a few onions. There were no guards, no trucks, no propaganda banners, only the muffled crunch of boots on snow and the sound of sacks landing in a growing pile by the church door. A gray-haired woman leaned on her cane, placed a small bundle down, and whispered to the man beside her, "God fed us enough. The rest belongs to someone hungrier." The words carried faintly through the still air, reaching even the camp fence. Vollmer froze. Back home, he had been told that Americans worshipped comfort, that money was their god. Yet here, they were giving away their dinners in the middle of a war. There was no music, no speeches, only wind brushing through the dry corn stalks left from harvest and a rooster's distant crow. The prisoners watched in silence, each man trying to reconcile what his eyes saw with what his mind refused to believe. Later, as night settled over the camp, Vollmer wrote a single question in his diary. They call themselves materialists. Then why do they give until it hurts? If you value stories like this, don't forget to like and subscribe. It helps preserve forgotten chapters of history. Tell us where you're watching from and what time it is there. Spring 1944 came late that year in Nebraska. Snow still clung to the edges of the barbed wire, but green shoots had begun to pierce the frozen earth. To the German officers behind the fence, it was a quiet miracle, one that mirrored what they were starting to see in the people around them. They had been told that Americans were driven by greed, that they built machines for profit and fought wars for oil. Yet each week, trucks rolled through the town carrying crates of milk, sacks of potatoes, and jars of jam to the same church storehouse. Across the country, a movement known as the Victory Gardens had turned over 20 million backyards into small farms. Housewives and schoolchildren grew beans and lettuce, not for themselves, but for soldiers and strangers. A farmer who had lost his only son in Normandy still arrived every Sunday with 2 pails of milk for the poor. Captain Vollmer noted the contradiction in his diary. They give while grieving, they lose and still plant. This is not the America I was told to despise. Inside the camp, rumors spread among the prisoners that even in cities like Chicago and Philadelphia, women queued outside community barns to donate flour for those who could not afford it. It wasn't about charity, it was about duty. The guards, ordinary men from Iowa and Kansas, explained it with a shrug. If we've got enough to eat, someone else should too. To the officers raised under a regime that glorified conquest, the idea was disorienting. In Germany, giving was a matter of command. Here, it was voluntary, and that made it more powerful. When Vollmer was allowed to work at the canning station near the camp fence, he noticed how carefully the American women packed food. They tied every jar with clean cloth, as if it were meant for their own family. One woman smiled and said, "We don't give because we have plenty. We give because we know hunger can come back." That night, as the wind carried the faint smell of baked bread from the nearby town, the officers sat in silence. One finally murmured, "Perhaps materialism means gratitude here." Beyond the wire, lanterns flickered across the fields, the glow of thousands of hands feeding others. For the first time, the prisoners wondered if generosity itself could be a weapon stronger than propaganda. The summer sun of 1944 stretched wide across the plains. By then, Captain Vollmer and his fellow officers had been assigned to light labor outside the camp, repairing fences, stacking hay, and helping at harvest under American supervision. It was on one of those mornings, in a field not far from Grand Island, that Vollmer witnessed something that left him wordless. A farmer named Thomas Avery, gray-haired and broad-shouldered, paused before cutting the first row of wheat. He removed his hat, dropped to one knee, and pressed his hand to the soil. The entire field seemed to fall silent. No machines, no voices, only the soft creak of wind through the stalks. Vollmer, who had been raised on Prussian efficiency and military order, stared in disbelief. The farmer's lips moved in prayer. "If someone out there goes hungry, it means I did not plant enough." Vollmer's shovel slipped from his grip. To him, prayer belonged in church, not in the dirt. But the gesture, simple, unforced, struck him as something beyond religion. It was responsibility, humility, reverence for life itself. In Germany, faith had been turned into nationalism. Here, faith was tied to the soil, to feeding others. Later that day, during lunch, Vollmer asked Avery why he prayed before work. The farmer chuckled. "It reminds me that I don't own any of this," he said, gesturing toward the land. "I'm just borrowing it to feed people, even enemies if they're hungry enough." That answer haunted Vollmer for days. He remembered his own father, a railway engineer who once said, "Our empire feeds the world through steel." Yet here stood a man who believed that feeding the world began with his own two hands. When the harvest ended, Avery invited the guards and prisoners to a small supper in his barn. Wooden tables, oil lamps, the scent of roasted corn, and coffee. Before eating, the farmer again bowed his head. The officers followed, hesitantly at first, then in silence. No orders, no flags, just gratitude. In his notebook that night, Vollmer wrote, "We believed technology was salvation, but these people find holiness in a loaf of bread." The next morning, as he watched the rising sun touch the golden fields, Vollmer felt a tremor of understanding. Perhaps strength wasn't in conquest, but in compassion that could kneel without shame. The night was cool and still, the air heavy with the scent of hay and the faint echo of cows shifting in their stalls. Captain Vollmer had been invited to the Avery farm again, this time not to harvest, but to help milk the cows before dawn. The barn lanterns cast slow-moving shadows along the walls as the farmer worked, quiet and deliberate. They talked little at first, only the rhythmic sound of milk hitting the metal pail. Then the farmer, his hands never stopping, asked gently, "Back in your country, do soldiers ever help the people?" Vollmer hesitated, unsure how to answer. Finally he said, "We help when ordered, when it serves the war." The farmer looked up and smiled faintly. "We help because God doesn't give orders. He just reminds us what's right." He nodded toward the camp lights in the distance. Even if you wear a different uniform, hunger's the same, cold's the same, a man's need doesn't change. It wasn't a debate, only a conversation between two men on opposite sides of a moral gulf. Yet the simplicity of the farmer's words unsettled Vollmer more than any interrogation could have. For years he had lived by directives, orders from Berlin, codes, ranks, and consequences. But this man, with no medals, no command, seemed freer than anyone Vollmer had ever met. A cow brushed against his sleeve and the farmer laughed softly. "Careful," he said. "She trusts slow hands." Vollmer smiled for the first time in months. It felt strange. After the milking, they carried the pails to the small wooden platform by the barn. The farmer poured one into a bottle and placed it aside. "This one's for the old widow down the road," he said. "She can't walk here anymore." Vollmer frowned. "You give it away? Milk is precious." The farmer shrugged. "That's why it means something when you share it." The words landed like a stone in the captain's chest. In the Reich, scarcity had bred hoarding. Here, scarcity bred compassion. As dawn crept through the fields, they stepped outside. The first light glowed on the barbed wire in the distance. Vollmer said quietly, "Maybe the difference between us isn't what we have, but who we think it's for." The farmer didn't answer. He only handed Vollmer a small bottle of fresh milk and said, "Take it, for the men in your barracks." That morning, for the first time, American milk passed between the hands of enemy soldiers without fear, without orders, without barter. Just the quiet understanding that sometimes kindness can flow through the smallest of acts, and that a simple barn could hold more wisdom than 1,000 speeches. The following weeks brought heavier skies. Late summer storms swept across Nebraska, and hunger began to creep into the towns again. Ration books were tighter, fuel scarcer. Yet even in that hardship, Vollmer witnessed something that cracked the last layer of his disbelief. One morning, while helping repair fences after the storm, he was sent with 2 guards to the outskirts of a small black neighborhood near Grand Island. There, he saw a sight that froze him mid-step. A poor African-American family, clothes patched, shoes worn thin, stood outside a small church holding a sack of flour. The father handed it to a white veteran who had lost his job at the factory. No speeches, no hesitation, just the transfer of bread between 2 calloused hands. The guards didn't speak. Even the wind seemed to stop. Vollmer wrote that night, "In Germany, color decides worth. Here, the poor feed the poor. Perhaps they know something we don't." The scene was no propaganda. It was part of the real wartime relief networks that spread across America. Community kitchens, neighbor-to-neighbor drives, church collections. Black families in Omaha had donated nearly 10,000 pounds of food in 1944 alone. For men raised under a system that worshipped hierarchy and purity, it was unthinkable that dignity could exist without rank. At the camp that evening, the prisoners argued about what they had seen. One officer sneered, "They're just showing off." Another replied, "Then why give to people who can't repay?" Vollmer stayed silent, watching the last crumbs of cornbread being shared among his men. The gesture from that morning lingered like a bruise on his conscience. He began to see the pattern. Generosity not as spectacle, but as instinct. A farmer giving eggs, a widow sharing milk, a black family offering flour. Each act repeated until it formed something larger than ideology, a culture of giving that needed no permission. A week later, when the church organized a food drive for families affected by the storm, several German officers stood behind the wire fence, watching wagons roll by, stacked with vegetables and canned goods. One of them whispered, "Materialistic people wouldn't do this." Vollmer answered, "Maybe their wealth isn't in money, but in mercy." And now, to you watching, what would you have done if you were that farmer, that widow, or that family with only one sack of flour left? Would you have given it away? Tell me in the comments, because the answer says more about our humanity than any war ever could. That night, as the camp lights dimmed, the men listened to thunder fading in the distance. For the first time, silence felt like reverence. Autumn arrived in streaks of gold and gray. The cornfields around Camp Atlanta turned brittle, waiting for harvest. By now, the German officers had changed in subtle ways. Their uniforms were faded, their shoulders less stiff. They had learned to say thank you in English, to nod back when a farmer waved, and to look at food not as spoils, but as grace. One morning, the camp superintendent announced that local farmers needed help gathering the remaining harvest before the frost. To everyone's surprise, a group of prisoners volunteered. No pay, no promise of better rations, just a simple request: let us help. At first, the guards hesitated. Then one said, "Fine, but no favors." That afternoon, 20 men marched into the fields carrying scythes and baskets. The farmers looked up from their work, uncertain. Then slowly, they began handing out gloves, ropes, even mugs of water. For Vollmer, that day marked the breaking point between observer and participant. He knelt beside Avery, cutting corn under a pale sky, sweat mixing with dust. The rhythm of work, swing, slice, gather, erased the border between them. When a child ran up with a basket of apples, Vollmer hesitated, unsure if he was allowed to take one. The farmer smiled. "You're working now, son. You've earned it." It was not charity anymore. It was cooperation. Quiet, wordless, profound. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, the farmers gathered for supper and insisted the POWs join. The table was long, improvised from planks and barrels. There was laughter, steam rising from stew pots, and the creak of wooden benches. Vollmer, seated among men who had once been his enemies, realized the paradox. In captivity, he had found his first taste of freedom. When they returned to camp, one American guard said lightly, "Guess that's one less field to worry about." Vollmer replied, "And one more field that belongs to both of us." He wrote in his diary that night, "If giving is power, then today we shared it. Not as conquerors or captives, but as men. Tell me, if you had been there, would you have joined them in that harvest? Or would you have stood apart, still holding on to old lines that war drew between us?" Outside the camp, the last fireflies flickered over the fields. Inside, men who had once believed only in orders now believed in effort freely given. And as sleep came, Vollmer dreamed, not of victory parades or medals, but of hands passing apples across a table under fading light. Spring 1945. The war was ending, though no one knew quite how to feel about it. In the camp yard, the snow melted into small rivers that cut through the dust and barbed wire. Rumors of Germany's collapse spread like wind. Berlin bombed, generals surrendering, Hitler gone from the radio. The prisoners stood silent, their empire dissolving in their minds. One morning, the camp gates opened for the last time. The men were to be processed for repatriation. Trucks waited to take them to the train station in Omaha. Vollmer stood with his small duffel and a folded diary in his coat pocket. He had not written about battles or ranks, only about milk, bread, and hands that gave. Before he boarded, Farmer Avery appeared holding a rough cloth bag. His face was older, weathered by 2 more seasons. He pressed something into Vollmer's hands, a round, warm loaf of bread, still fragrant from the oven. "This is the last one before you go," he said quietly. "Eat it on the train, and plant these when you get home." Inside the bag lay a handful of wheat seeds. Vollmer could not speak. He saluted awkwardly, but the farmer only shook his head and extended his hand instead. "No ranks here, just men trying to start over." 2 years later, in 1947, a letter arrived at the Avery farm. It came from Stuttgart, Germany. The envelope held a photograph of a small field and a few stalks of wheat bending in the wind. The letter read, "Dear Mr. Avery, I planted the seeds. They grew, though the soil is tired and the air still remembers the sirens. You taught me something no doctrine ever could, that material things, when shared, become sacred. I used to think faith belonged to churches. Now I know it also lives in barns, in kitchens, in the quiet act of giving." The letter ended with a line that seemed to echo across continents. "I once believed your people worshipped matter, but perhaps only those who cherish matter truly understand what is divine." Back in Nebraska, Avery read it aloud at church. The congregation sat still, listening to the words of a former enemy who had learned how to sow peace. Outside, children chased each other through the wheat fields, their laughter carried on the same wind that once smelled of war. The loaf and the seeds had completed their circle. From a hungry winter in 1944 to a fragile harvest in 1947, proving that giving does not diminish what we have, it multiplies what we are. When the fences finally rusted away and the camps were reclaimed by grass, the memory of those years remained, not as stories of victory or defeat, but as quiet lessons about what survives when ideologies crumble. For Captain Vollmer and thousands like him, captivity in America became an unexpected classroom of the human spirit. They had come expecting opulence, arrogance, indulgence. Instead, they found people who prayed before work, who shared food with strangers, and who gave away the last loaf on their table without fear of becoming poorer. History rarely records such moments. We count tanks and planes, but not the sacks of grain left at a church door. Yet, it is those invisible acts that redraw the boundaries of civilization. Empires fall, doctrines fade, but kindness has a strange endurance. It hides in barns, in breadlines, in the simple decision to give. Years later, when Vollmer was an old man tending a small garden outside Stuttgart, he was often seen kneeling before his crops in silence. A neighbor once asked if he was praying. He smiled and said, "No, I'm just remembering."